2 months, the U.S. military has killed at least 61 people in 14 strikes against alleged drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean Sea and now the Pacific Ocean.
President Trump has justified these attacks as necessary. He says they're to halt the flow of drugs coming into the U.S. and even stated the United States is engaged in armed conflict with drug cartels that he has designated as terrorist groups. These strikes have raised concerns in Congress over the limits, or lack thereof, of presidential power, and some fear the United States is pursuing a policy of regime change in Venezuela. For more analysis, we're joined this morning by Ryan Berg of the Center for International Studies. He is the director of their Americas program. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us this morning. If you can, give us sort of a lay of the land, or I guess lay of the sea, in terms of the amount of forces that have been deployed to this region.
Well, it's great to be on with you this morning. I think we use the word unprecedented a lot in analysis these days with the Trump administration in power, but I think this is truly unprecedented, at least going back until 1989, when the U.S. engaged in Operation Just Cause, the overthrow of the regime of dictator Manuel Noriega in Panama. So once the carrier strike group and its associated escorts get to the Southern Caribbean region, the U.S. will have something like 13 or so of its most valued, treasured assets in this small space. And overall, something like 10% of the current deployed forces or the deployed vessels for the U.S. Navy are in this region. So we're talking about a significant buildup, a buildup that this area of responsibility, that is Southcom, is not used to seeing, and a buildup that the Caribbean Basin is not used to seeing. They're far more accustomed to seeing U.S. Coast Guard cutters and U.S. Coast Guard presence than they are Air Force and Navy. And so this is an unprecedented situation. And I think the carrier strike group announcement on Friday just serves to punctuate or emphasize the point that I think something is going to happen beyond these 14 strikes that you mentioned in your intro.
So the idea that the president and the administration are referring to these boats as narco-terrorists and that this big response is all about these narco-terrorists. We spoke to a retired Coast Guard admiral the other day who used to be in charge of that region, and he said, look, you know, where are the evidence that they're actually terrorists? If they were terrorists, they would be a threat to the United States in terms of wanting to kill people. It would have to be intentional. And this, you know, not so much. He thinks that, you know, people don't want to kill their customers.
Well, this is the argument that the administration is advancing is on new legal grounds. It is an argument that drug trafficking presents an imminent threat to the United States and that we are, in fact, in a war with these organizations, which are no longer criminal organizations, but legally they've been designated as foreign terrorist organizations. And so the administration, I think we should take them at their word. They believe that they are in a war, that the United States is in a war with these organizations that are trafficking deadly substances to the United States. And to further their argument, they say that, in fact, this is a war with a body count. Tragically, every year, about 100,000 or more Americans perish of drug overdoses. So this is a war, in their opinion, just like any other, where there's a body count. There are organizations that are responsible for it, and I think we're actively seeing the administration impose what they think is a new paradigm here for dealing with these organizations. As I mentioned, usually we see the Coast Guard in the region dealing with these organizations from a more law enforcement perspective. Now what we see is the administration shifting that responsibility over to the U.S. Navy, over to the Air Force, and making it more of a military-style approach to dealing with these organizations. That's a paradigm shift that they seem to be expanding to the entire region now. As you mentioned again in your intro, strikes now in the Pacific theater, not just in the Southern Caribbean.
Ryan, you told earlier, the Financial Times earlier this month, quote, it's clear that the mission is evolving to become more of a regime collapse or a regime change operation. More and more, we're banking on Maduro hightailing it out of Caracas and a clean out of the top 25 to 50 Chavistas. What did you mean by that regime collapse and not necessarily regime change?
It's a great distinction, and I'm glad that you asked me that question, because I think this is something analytically we need to distinguish. So regime change I associate with a boots on the ground overthrow of a government type of situation. That is not the modus operandi of President Trump. He campaigned against forever wars. We know that the coalition he represents hates these open-ended commitments, and frankly, for good reason. They haven't achieved strategic objectives of the United States over the last 2 decades. Regime collapse, on the other hand, involves something that the United States might be able to do from the outside, say with U.S. precision-guided munitions, Tomahawk missiles, for example, at a safe distance, striking facilities that are, say, dual use. They're right at the intersection of the criminal state nexus in Venezuela. They could be airstrips that belong to the military, or they could be a Navy port that also double as embarkation points for drug trafficking. In a regime collapse type of scenario, the military, the Venezuelan military in that case, would decide that it could be better off without Maduro than with Maduro. And so there are plenty of ways in which U.S. action, which could move from the sea to the land, as the president continues to say, could trigger or catalyze movement internally within Venezuela such that the armed forces are sort of the guardian of a democratic transition. That doesn't involve U.S. boots on the ground. That doesn't involve any other assets other than what's in the region. And it keeps U.S. service members at a safe distance from their target. I think that's much more in line with President Trump's modus operandi than the kind of boots on the ground regime change or government overthrow operations we've seen in the past decades.
So the U.S. doesn't have a particularly good track record in Central and South America. And this show of force that we really haven't done before in this region is now alienating former allies and creating a lot of unease throughout the region. Can you explain how that might land with them and what the consequences could be?
Well, I actually think that in this case, the administration has been pretty surprised at the outpouring of support that it has received for the deployment. So the loudest voice and the most obvious voice in disagreement has been Gustavo Petro, the leftist president of Colombia. And he's been very vocal in his criticisms, and now that the Trump administration has decided to sanction him personally and his family for what they say is involvement in the drug trade. But surprisingly, there have been a number of countries that have expressed an outpouring of support for the U.S. deployment, and some, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Peru, Paraguay, and Argentina, in the last month, have actually declared the Tren de Aragua and the Cartel de los Soles to be foreign terrorist organizations as well. So if you're sitting in the White House, what this looks like is actually synchronization or harmonization with your approach than it does criticism of the approach. And to further, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Jamaica, other countries in the Caribbean that are affected by the region's security challenges have also been pretty supportive of the U.S. deployment. So as a Latin American analyst, I've been surprised. I expected there to be more criticism than just the very vocal stuff that's coming from President Petro. However, there hasn't been as much as I expected. And many governments who do disagree, say the Mexican government, for example, have been very quiet in their disagreement and channeling those through the diplomatic channels that we have with those countries.
Ryan, we've got about 30 seconds left. Let's say you were a member of Congress and you're sitting in this briefing that's going to happen at 10 a.m. regarding these strikes off the coast of Venezuela. What would you ask the administration, if you could, when it comes to this topic?
Well, I think I'd be very interested in hearing if the administration is indeed serious, as the president says, about going to strike land in Venezuela. The president says we're going to do land next, by which I interpret he means strike targets within Venezuela potentially. If that is the next move, what he calls phase 2 in this campaign, then I would want to know what kinds of targets we are going to be aiming at, because there are all types of targets in a country like Venezuela, which is heavily involved in criminal activity. And you could hit targets that are purely criminal in nature, or you could hit targets that imply a higher risk tolerance, which are both criminal but also state assets. And I think that's a key distinction and also a key indicator, not only of what this mission might be and how it might be evolving, but also the level of risk, the risk appetite, if you will, that the administration has for strikes potentially in Venezuela. I think that's part of Congress's oversight duty, and if I were a member, that's certainly what I would be asking.
All right, Ryan, thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate your insights. That's Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program and Head of the Future of Venezuela Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.